how to take back your power in a world that doubts you. Welcome, the anointed ones. The moment you decide you've had enough is the moment everything changes. For centuries, human survival depended on the acceptance of others. To be cast out meant vulnerability, even death. But let's be real. No one is facing saber-toothed tigers anymore. Today, the real predators hide behind screens, armed with opinions and Wi-Fi. Critics are everywhere, waiting to sink their claws into your confidence, whispering, sometimes shouting, that you're not smart enough, strong enough, or talented enough. And maybe, for a while, you listened. Maybe you even believed them. But then, something shifted. The same way David faced Goliath with nothing but a slingshot and faith, the people of Syria reached their breaking point. Standing up against a force that seemed unbeatable, they didn't wait for permission. They didn't beg for validation. They declared, "Enough is enough." And in that moment, everything changed. Because here's the truth. When you stop playing by the rules critics set for you, when you reclaim your own power, the world takes notice. So how do you silence the voices that try to define you? How do you step into the life you were meant to live? Let's break it down. For a long time, you listened. Maybe you even believed them. The voices that told you you weren't enough. The critics who doubted your strength, your intelligence, your purpose. But then, something shifted. You reached a moment where you couldn't ignore the truth any longer. You were never meant to live by their rules. You were never meant to be confined by their expectations. So, you stood up, you drew a line in the sand, and with a clarity that left no room for hesitation, you said, "Enough is enough." And in that moment, everything changed. You silenced the critics, not with arguments, not with explanations, but with bold, unapologetic action. You reclaimed your power, not by convincing them, but by choosing yourself. And trust me, the world is taking notice. Because here's the thing. History has shown us that the underestimated often rise. The Syrian opposition was mocked, dismissed as weak, unorganized, incapable of change. But like David facing Goliath, they refused to be defined by their enemy's perception of them. They didn't wait for permission to exist. They fought back, and when the world doubted them, they proved that sometimes the smallest stone can bring down the mightiest giant. If this message resonates with you, don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Hit that like button and subscribe, because every time you do, you're sending a message. You refuse to be silenced. You refuse to stay small. And together, we rise. So how did you do it? How do you silence the critics and reclaim your power? Let's break it down. Rule number 1. Stop debating people who aren't listening. Some people don't argue to understand. They argue to dominate. They aren't listening. They're just waiting for their turn to speak, to push their opinion, to drown out your voice. And for a while, maybe you played along. You explained. You justified. You tried to prove yourself, believing that if you just said the right words, they'd finally get it. But they never did they? Because they weren't listening in the first place. That's when everything clicked. You realized that the only way to win was to stop showing up to the debate, not in a passive, "I give up" kind of way, but in a bold, deliberate decision that said, "My energy is too valuable for this nonsense." So you stopped. You stopped reacting to every comment, every passive-aggressive jab, every veiled insult disguised as concern. And here's the wild part. The moment you stopped engaging, the critics lost their power. Because criticism, just like fire, only burns as long as you keep feeding it. When you stopped giving them your attention, their words turned to ash. History has shown us this truth time and time again. David didn't waste time arguing with the Philistine army about whether he was qualified to fight Goliath. He stepped onto the battlefield and let his actions do the talking. And in Syria, the opposition once believed negotiation could bring change. They tried reasoning, pushing for reforms, appealing to the system. But a system designed to silence them would never hear them. So like David, they stopped wasting energy on debates that would never end. Instead, they focused on decisive action. And that shift, that moment when they refused to engage on their enemy's terms, became the beginning of real change. The lesson is simple. Your power isn't in proving yourself to people who have already decided not to see you. Your power is in walking away and doing what they said you couldn't. You silence the critics, not by arguing, not by explaining, but by moving forward. At first, their words weighed on you. You carried them. Let them take up space in your mind, rehearsing responses to arguments that would never change anything. But the moment you stopped reacting, something incredible happened. The noise faded. Their words lost their grip. Because, here's the truth, criticism only has power when you give it attention. Like a fire, it needs fuel. The moment you stopped feeding it, it burned out. And while they kept talking, you were busy building, growing, and winning. You shifted your focus from proving yourself to becoming unstoppable. History repeats itself. The Syrian opposition faced relentless propaganda from Assad's government, designed to discredit them, to drown out their voices. For years, they tried to respond, to defend, to justify their cause. But nothing changed, because the system was built to silence them. Then came the shift. Instead of fighting back with words, they took action. They organized, they strategized, they moved. And in doing so, they rewrote the narrative. That's the lesson. You don't silence critics by shouting louder. You silence them by proving through action that they never had control over you to begin with. Rule number 2, confront your inner critic. First, the loudest critic you'll ever face isn't on social media. It's not your coworkers, your family, or even the people who doubt you from afar. It's the voice inside your own head. That voice remembers every mistake you've ever made. It magnifies your insecurities, whispers doubts into your ear right before you take a bold step forward. And here's the brutal truth. As long as that voice controls you, the outside critics don't even have to try. You're already doing their job for them. At first, you probably didn't even notice how loud that inner critic had become. It was just there, running in the background like a bad song on repeat. You're not good enough. You'll mess this up. They're going to judge you. And even when the world wasn't saying a word, you still believed it. Because external criticism hurts, but internal criticism convinces. Then one day, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe you just got sick of carrying the weight of self-doubt. Whatever it was, you decided to confront that voice head on. You stopped taking it at face value. You challenged it. You asked one simple question. Is this even true? Most of the time, the answer was no. That voice wasn't wise. It was just scared. It repeated old fears because that's all it knew. But once you saw it for what it really was, it lost its power. The same battle happens on a much larger scale. The people of Syria faced a seemingly impossible fight. They weren't just up against a brutal regime, they were up against their own doubts. Can we really stand against such a massive force? Will the world even recognize our struggle? But like David stepping onto the battlefield, they had to conquer their inner fears before they could face the real fight. They silenced their own doubts first, and that prepared them for battle. And that's the lesson. Until you defeat the critic in your mind, every battle you fight will feel unwinnable. But the moment you own your narrative, the outside voices lose their power. Rule number 3, become your own source of validation. There's something exhausting about constantly waiting for others to approve of your worth. You try to impress, adapt, and win validation. from bosses, friends, family, even strangers on the internet. And for what? A fleeting compliment? A temporary pat on the back? But here's the problem. When your self-worth depends on someone else's opinion, you're handing them control over your happiness. At first, you probably didn't even realize you were doing it. Maybe you were just trying to be polite, trying to fit in. But over time, your success became tied to their reactions. Did they like what I said? Did they notice my effort? Am I enough for them? And when the approval didn't come, or worse, when criticism took its place, it stung hard. Then came the turning point. Maybe it was a slow realization, or maybe it hit you like a ton of bricks. Either way, you saw the truth. You will never win by playing for other people's applause. Some people will never be impressed. Others will praise you today and criticize you tomorrow. Living for their validation is a game rigged against you. So, you quit the game. Instead of waiting for someone else to tell you that you did a good job, you looked in the mirror and told yourself. You celebrated your own progress, even when nobody else noticed. You stopped needing their approval because you gave yourself something far better, genuine self-respect. And here's the crazy part. The moment you stopped seeking validation, people started giving it anyway. But by then, it didn't even matter. Because now, your value isn't up for negotiation. Parallels with the fall of the Assad regime. This isn't just a personal battle. This same dynamic has played out on the world stage. For years, Syria's opposition forces sought validation from the international community. They waited for global leaders to recognize their cause, to step in, to give them legitimacy. But recognition never came, not in the way they hoped. Governments hesitated. Some doubted their strength. Others refused to take sides. And for a time, that lack of validation made the opposition feel powerless, as if their cause wasn't real until someone else acknowledged it. But then, something shifted. They stopped waiting for the world's approval. They stopped looking to foreign leaders for permission to exist. Instead, they focused on building their own power. And once they did that, the momentum changed. The world had no choice but to take notice. The lesson is clear. Whether it's on the battlefield or in your own life, you don't need anyone's permission to be great. You don't need someone else to tell you that you're worthy, capable, or strong enough. You already are. The only question is, do you believe it yet? Rule number 4. Proving them wrong is still giving them control. It feels good to imagine the moment, the day you finally succeed, the look on their faces when they realize they were wrong about you, the doubters, the critics, the ones who said you couldn't do it. You picture yourself standing victorious, proving them all wrong. But here's the hidden trap. When your success is driven by proving someone else wrong, they're still in control of your story. Because in that moment, your choices, your goals, even your victories aren't fully yours. They're still rooted in someone else's opinion. Whether you win or lose, your path is being shaped by the very people you were trying to escape. That's when it hits you. True power doesn't come from revenge. It comes from freedom. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. Your success isn't about them. It's about you. Real-world application. The fall of Assad wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about freedom. This lesson isn't just personal, it's historical. For years, the Syrian opposition wasn't fighting just to prove Assad wrong. They weren't trying to make him admit defeat or to hear him say, "You were right and I was wrong." That wasn't the goal. They were fighting for freedom. Like David stepping onto the battlefield against Goliath, the rebels didn't fight for approval. They weren't seeking permission to exist. They weren't looking for validation from their oppressors. They fought because they refused to live under tyranny any longer. They fought for their destiny, not for revenge. And that's exactly what you need to do. Stop making success about proving someone else wrong. Make it about reclaiming your own power. The moment you stop caring about their opinions, whether they doubt you, dismiss you, or try to undermine you, is the moment you become unstoppable. Because success isn't about silencing critics. It's about rising so high that their voices no longer matter. Rule number 5. Use criticism as a blueprint for mastery. Criticism stings. There's no way around it. When someone doubts your abilities or tears down your efforts, the natural instinct is to either lash out or retreat. But here's a secret that most people miss. Buried within every insult, every harsh critique, is an opportunity to improve. The greatest leaders, the most unstoppable individuals, don't crumble under criticism. They use it as fuel. Instead of taking it personally, they dissect it. They ask themselves, is there truth in this? And when there is, they make adjustments. If someone pointed out a flaw in their work, they didn't sulk. They fixed it. If someone doubted their skill, they honed it until there was no room left for doubt. That's the difference between those who grow and those who stay stuck. Because when you learn to separate constructive feedback from destructive noise, you gain a powerful edge. Most people never master this skill. They either get defensive or let negativity defeat them. But if you can learn to listen without ego, to take what's useful and discard the rest, you can turn even your biggest critics into unwilling mentors. Syrian opposition strategy, turning doubt into strength. This principle isn't just personal, it's strategic. It's how entire movements survive and thrive. The Syrian opposition was mocked and dismissed. The world called them weak, disorganized, incapable of real change. For years, their critics, both internal and external, told them they would never win. And at times, even they doubted themselves. But instead of collapsing under the weight of those words, they adapted. They took the criticism and used it as a map for improvement. If the world said they were too divided, they worked on unity. If their strategies were ineffective, they adjusted. If they lacked resources, they found creative ways to fight. With every doubt, every insult, they refined their approach until they were stronger than anyone expected. And that's the lesson. Criticism can break you, or it can build you. It all depends on what you do with it. So the next time someone underestimates you, don't waste energy proving them wrong with words. Let your success be your response. Take what's useful, sharpen your skills, and come back so strong that even your loudest critics have nothing left to say. Because the truth is, when you master your craft, when you reach the level of excellence that speaks for itself, critics don't get silenced. They become irrelevant. Rule number 6. Outgrow the spaces where you aren't respected. Not every room deserves you. Not every space is worthy of your presence. But for too long, you tried to make it work. You poured your energy into proving yourself. At work, in friendships, in environments that refuse to acknowledge your value. You thought if you worked harder, explained yourself better, showed them who you really were, they'd finally see your worth. But no matter what you did, it always felt like you were pushing against a wall. Then, one day, you realized something that changed everything. You were never going to win in a space built to overlook you. Respect isn't something you can beg for. It's not something you can force. It has to be freely given. And if the people around you refuse to offer it, then it's time to stop wasting your energy trying to earn it. So you made a bold decision. You stopped shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that couldn't contain your potential. Instead of waiting for permission to be seen, you sought out new environments, places where your presence was valued. And when you couldn't find those spaces, you built your own, because that's what true growth looks like. You don't wait for a seat at someone else's table. You build your own. Historical parallel. The Syrian people refused to stay in a system that didn't value them. This isn't just a personal lesson, it's a universal truth. For decades, The Syrian people were forced to exist under a dictatorship that never valued them. Their voices didn't matter. Their rights didn't matter. No matter how hard they tried to negotiate or appeal for justice, the system was built to ignore them. But just like David stepping onto the battlefield, they made a choice. They stopped waiting to be recognized. They stopped hoping for change within a system that was never designed to include them. Instead, they took action. They carved out their own path. They didn't beg for permission to exist. They claimed their right to fight for their future, and that's exactly what you need to do. If you are constantly fighting to be seen, if you feel like you have to prove your worth to people who refuse to acknowledge it, you are in the wrong room. Real respect doesn't have to be demanded. It's given freely. So stop seeking approval from people who will never give it. Step into places where you are celebrated, not just tolerated. And if you can't find those places, create them. Because the moment you stop fighting for scraps of validation is the moment you step into your true power. Rule number 7. Refuse to become what they expect. Critics love to put people in boxes. They thrive on predictability. Because when they can anticipate your reaction, they can control the narrative. Maybe they expected you to lash out when they insulted you. Maybe they thought you'd break when life got hard. Maybe they assumed you'd shrink under pressure, too afraid to challenge the system that tried to define you. But you didn't give them the satisfaction. Instead of reacting emotionally, you moved with composure, creativity, and courage. You refused to let their negativity turn you bitter. You didn't conform to their expectations, nor did you seek their approval. You simply did what they never saw coming. You took control of your own story. They wanted you to play small. You raised the bar. They hoped you'd lose confidence. You grew bolder with every challenge. They tried to dictate your limits. You rewrote the rules entirely. And here's the powerful truth. Disobedience isn't just about rebellion. It's about liberation. When you stop living by their rules, when you stop reacting in the way they expect, you become unstoppable. You're no longer playing their game. You're creating your own. Historical parallel. The Syrian rebels weren't what Assad expected. The same principle applies on the world stage. When the Syrian opposition first rose against Assad's dictatorship, he expected them to break. He believed they would scatter, crumble under pressure, and surrender to fear. His regime used every weapon, propaganda, military force, psychological warfare, to push them into submission. But they didn't break. Instead of falling into his trap, they became more strategic, more united, and more powerful than anyone predicted. They refused to react in the way he had planned. They didn't just resist. They adapted. They learned. They evolved. They refused to be defined by their enemy. And in doing so, they reclaimed their power. That's exactly what you must do in your own life. If your critics expect you to lash out, respond with calm, calculated action. If they want you to feel powerless, build strength they can't comprehend. If they think they can control your future, show them they never had that power to begin with. Because at the end of the day, true victory isn't about fighting louder. It's about refusing to be controlled. When you step outside their expectations, when you refuse to become what they predict, you become something they cannot touch. And that kind of power, it changes everything. Rule number 8. Stop fighting battles that don't serve your future. Some battles are loud, messy, and draining. They pull you into arguments, demand your time and energy, and force you to defend yourself. All for a win that's barely worth it. At first, you might have thought you had to fight every single one. Maybe you didn't want to seem weak. Maybe you felt an obligation to prove yourself. But here's the truth. Not every fight is yours to fight. When you're constantly swinging at shadows, you lose sight of what really matters. Then one day, you realize something powerful. Fighting just to be right, just to satisfy your ego, was costing you more than it was worth. Time, energy, mental peace. These were resources you couldn't afford to waste. So, you changed your approach. When someone tried to provoke you, you didn't take the bait. Instead, you paused. You asked yourself one simple question: is this worth my future? If the answer was no, you walked away. Not out of weakness, but out of strength. And here's the surprising part. Walking away was more powerful than staying. It confused the people who thrived on chaos and arguments. They were left standing there, fists clenched, with nothing to fight against. Meanwhile, you kept your focus on what mattered: your growth, your goals, your peace. By choosing your battles wisely, you reclaimed your most valuable asset, your time. Syrian opposition's turning point: when they stopped fighting the wrong battle. This isn't just personal, it's a strategy that has shaped history. When the Syrian opposition first rose against Assad's dictatorship, they thought they could change the system from within. They tried negotiations. They appealed for reforms. They fought battles designed to work within the framework of a system that was built to suppress them. But then, they had a turning point. They realized the system itself was the problem. No amount of negotiating would change a dictatorship designed to silence them. No amount of appealing to justice would sway those who thrived on control. So, instead of continuing a fight that led nowhere, they stopped engaging on Assad's terms. They stopped trying to reform what was broken and focused on building something new. That shift in strategy changed everything. And that's exactly what you must do in your own life. Stop wasting time fighting for approval in places that were never meant to recognize your worth. Stop arguing with people who have already decided not to listen. Stop engaging in battles that don't push you forward. Instead, invest your energy where it truly matters. The strongest move isn't always winning the argument. Sometimes it's walking away and proving, through your success, that they never had power over you in the first place. Rule number 9. Master the art of quiet transformation. In a world that rewards loud announcements and public displays of success, it's tempting to share every step of your journey. Social media thrives on instant validation, on likes and comments that make you feel seen. But here's the truth. Announcing your plans is easy. Following through without applause, that's where real strength lies. At first, you might have felt the urge to let people know what you were working on, to prove to the world that you were making progress. But then you realized something powerful. Real success doesn't need a press release. So you chose a different path. Instead of making grand proclamations about what you were going to achieve, you simply got to work, quietly, consistently, without the need for fanfare. You didn't focus on looking successful. You focused on becoming successful. And at first, some people probably thought you had faded into the background. Maybe they assumed you had given up. Maybe they whispered that you weren't making progress. But that's the beauty of quiet transformation. It catches people off guard. They don't see it coming until it's undeniable. While they were busy seeking attention, you were mastering your craft, refining your skills, building something real. And when you finally did show up, it wasn't with empty promises. It was with results that spoke for themselves. The critics who once doubted you had no choice but to take notice, because your transformation was too obvious to dismiss. And the best part? You didn't need their approval. Because success built in silence doesn't need an audience. It speaks for itself. Historical parallel: Assad's fall. A silent shift in power. This lesson isn't just personal. It's how revolutions happen. While the world was distracted by the politics of international diplomacy, Syrian rebels weren't making announcements. They were making moves. At first, many dismissed them as disorganized, too weak to challenge Assad's control. But behind the scenes, something was happening. They were quietly gaining ground. They weren't shouting about Their strategies, they weren't seeking validation. They were adapting, training, and strengthening their position. And when the moment was right, they struck decisively. The world had no choice but to recognize the shift in power, because by the time they noticed, it was already happening. That's how you move in life. Don't waste time broadcasting every step of your journey. Let your success be the announcement. Because the loudest transformations aren't the ones people talk about. They're the ones no one sees coming. Rule Jordan 10. Embrace radical accountability. Most people run from accountability. They shift blame, make excuses, and avoid owning their mistakes because it's uncomfortable. It stings. But here's the truth. When you refuse to take responsibility for your failures, you hand your critics a weapon they can use against you. The moment you deny, deflect, or cover up your shortcomings, you look weak, defensive, untrustworthy. That's why you took a different path. Instead of running from your mistakes, you faced them head-on. You didn't sugarcoat them. You didn't try to rewrite history to protect your ego. You acknowledged where you went wrong. You made it right, and you grew from it. And in doing so, you stripped your critics of their power. What could they say about you that you hadn't already admitted? Nothing. By taking full ownership of your life, your wins and your failures, you became untouchable. The unexpected power of owning your mistakes. Radical accountability isn't just about silencing critics, it's about growth. By admitting where you fell short, you created a roadmap for improvement. You learned from your missteps instead of letting them define you. Every setback became a stepping stone. And with every lesson, you became stronger, sharper, and more resilient. Here's the ironic part. People didn't lose respect for you when you admitted your mistakes. They respected you more, because in a world where everyone is quick to pass the blame, true accountability stands out. It shows confidence. It shows integrity. It shows that you are the kind of person who doesn't just talk about growth. You live it. And that's what makes you unstoppable. Syria's leadership shift. How the rebels adapted. This principle isn't just personal. It's how revolutions succeed. At the beginning of the Syrian uprising, opposition groups made mistakes. They lacked coordination. They underestimated their challenges. They struggled to unify, and their critics, inside and outside the country, pounced on every misstep. But instead of making excuses, instead of getting defensive, they adapted. They took accountability for what wasn't working. They improved their strategy. They learned from past failures and became more organized, more disciplined, and more effective than anyone expected. And in doing so, they gained strength their opponents never saw coming. Own your story. And no one can use it against you if you want real power in life. Own everything, your wins and your losses. Take responsibility, not just when things go right, but when they go wrong. Because when you embrace radical accountability, your failures don't define you. Your response does. And when you stop running from your past, when you stop fearing your mistakes, when you own your story fully, no one can ever use it against you again. Rule number 11. Learn. When silence is a weapon, silence has a bad reputation. People mistake it for weakness, defeat, or a lack of confidence. But here's what you figured out. Silence can be one of the most powerful moves in your arsenal if you know how to use it. At first, when people criticized you, your instinct was to respond, to jump in, defend yourself, explain your side, set the record straight. But the more you engaged, the more power you gave them. Then came the shift. You realized that silence wasn't just a retreat. It was a strategic pause. When used wisely, silence disarms critics, deflects negativity, and gives you the upper hand. Silence became your shield, When arguments weren't worth your energy, you held your ground and let the noise pass. But silence wasn't just a shield, it was also a weapon. In situations where your presence spoke louder than words, silence created tension. Tension that made people listen harder. It forced others to fill the void with their own assumptions, often revealing more about themselves than about you. And here's the best part. Silence gave you time to think, to process, to act with intention, not emotion. While others were busy talking, you were strategizing. And when you finally did speak, your words carried more weight because they were rare and purposeful. You mastered the art of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. It wasn't about avoidance, it was about control. And in a world that thrives on noise, that kind of control, it made you unstoppable. Real-world example: the Syrian rebels and Assad's self-destruction. This lesson isn't just personal. It's a strategy that has played out on the world stage. The rebels fighting against Assad didn't always respond to every attack, every accusation, every move he made. Instead, they let Assad's own actions expose his weaknesses. While he ranted, threatened, and used propaganda to discredit them, they stayed focused on their strategy. They didn't fight battles that weren't worth it. They didn't react impulsively to every attack. They let silence work in their favor. And in doing so, they let the world see the truth without needing to shout it themselves. Use silence as your power. Move. There will always be people who try to drag you into pointless battles. They'll provoke you. They'll insult you. They'll try to get a reaction. But here's the secret: you don't owe them one. Your silence will tell them everything they need to know. Because real power isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about knowing when to say nothing at all. Rule number 12. Redefine failure. Failure is not the end, it's evolution. For a long time, failure felt like proof. Proof that you weren't smart enough, strong enough, or capable enough. Every mistake felt like a public verdict on your worth, and you carried that weight like a badge of shame. But then, everything changed. You stopped seeing failure as the enemy and started seeing it for what it truly is: a teacher. Here's a truth most people don't realize. The people who never fail are the ones who never try. They stay in their comfort zones, safe from judgment, but also safe from growth. That's when it clicked. Failure wasn't a sign that you were losing. It was evidence that you were evolving. The power of embracing failure. With that mindset shift, the critics lost their power. Their taunts no longer stung because you weren't measuring yourself by their shallow standards. You weren't chasing perfection. You were chasing progress. And progress is messy. It's supposed to be. Instead of hiding your failures, you started dissecting them. What went wrong? What could you do better next time? Each stumble became a stepping stone toward mastery. And as you embraced failure, something amazing happened. You became unshakable. Setbacks didn't derail you anymore. They fueled you and the critics. They grew quieter, because it's hard to mock someone who wears their failures like armor. Your resilience was intimidating, because it showed them one undeniable truth: you couldn't be broken. Real-world example: the Syrian resistance and the lessons of defeat. This isn't just a personal lesson. It's a principle that has shaped history. Take the Syrian opposition. They faced failure over and over again. Losses in battle, crushed protests, international leaders turning their backs. At any point, they could have given up. But they didn't. Every setback forced them to adapt. They became smarter, more strategic, more disciplined. Every failure taught them something new. And eventually, they gained ground. Their struggle wasn't about proving doubters wrong. It was about becoming strong enough to take control of their own destiny. Failure is the path to power. Here's the irony. The moment you stopped fearing failure, you became unstoppable. True power comes from knowing that no failure is final. You learned that lesson. You lived it. And that realization, it set you free. And that freedom? It's a victory no critic can ever take away. Rule not 113. Build a legacy instead of chasing. Approval is addictive. The likes, the compliments, the applause, they feel good, even if they're fleeting. At first, you might have gotten caught up in the chase, bending over backward to gain validation from people who barely mattered. But deep down, you knew there was a problem. Approval is temporary. But legacy is forever. The moment, everything shifted. There came a moment when you asked yourself a tough question. What am I building that will outlast the noise? The answer wasn't pretty. Too much of your energy had been spent trying to win over people who wouldn't even remember your name in a year. Their opinions were like sand slipping through your fingers, no matter how tightly you tried to hold on. So you shifted your focus. You stopped caring about momentary applause and started thinking long-term. What impact do I want to have? What values do I want to embody? What work will still matter decades from now? Those were the questions that guided you moving forward. And the critics, obsessed with tearing down your present, they couldn't comprehend your new mindset. They were stuck in the now while you were building something timeless. They criticized your moves, but you were too focused on creating something that would outlast their words. Legacy versus approval, the power of purpose. Here's the beautiful part. Legacy doesn't need applause to be valid. You started working with quiet, confident purpose, knowing that the seeds you planted today would bear fruit in the future. You didn't need them to see it or approve of it. You knew your work would speak for itself when the time was right. And while they faded into irrelevance, you built something meaningful. And that's a victory far greater than any fleeting approval. Real-world parallel. The Syrian Revolution's lasting impact. This lesson doesn't just apply to individuals. It's the story of history. Look at the Syrian opposition. Their fight was never just about one man. Even beyond Assad, it was about an entire generation's future. They weren't fighting for temporary recognition. They were building a movement, something that would outlast any dictator, any regime, any criticism. Their legacy, it's still unfolding. Because real change isn't measured in applause. It's measured in impact. Legacy over validation. You stopped chasing approval because you realized it was a game rigged against you. Some people will never be impressed. Others will like you today and criticize you tomorrow. So why waste your energy trying to please them? Instead, you built something real, something lasting. You created a life that didn't depend on other people's opinions. Because in the end, it's not about being liked, it's about being remembered for the right reasons. Rule number 14. Let your actions speak in the end. Success is not about proving critics wrong. It's about thriving for yourself. You realize that you didn't want to carry the weight of resentment or let the opinions of others dictate your path. So you made a powerful decision. You chose to thrive, not out of defiance, but out of peace. This wasn't about silence as retreat. It was about reclaiming your focus. Instead of wasting time on comebacks or petty battles, you poured that energy into your growth, your craft, and your happiness. You built a life that made you proud. Not because it silenced the critics, but because it fulfilled you. And then, something ironic happened. When you let your actions do the talking, people couldn't help but listen. Even the loudest doubters had to acknowledge your success. But by then, it didn't even matter. Their opinions had become nothing more than irrelevant, background noise. You weren't thriving to spite them. You were thriving for yourself. And that shift? That was the ultimate victory. Your success wasn't about vengeance. It was about liberation. You were no longer bound by their expectations or fueled by their negativity. You moved with intention, joy, and purpose. And in doing so, you set yourself free. A legacy of freedom. The Syrian uprising. This lesson isn't just personal, it's historical. Look at the people of Syria. They didn't fight to satisfy doubters. They fought for their right to exist on their own terms. Just like David against Goliath, they weren't seeking approval. They were taking back their power. The revolution was never about one battle. It was about a movement. It was about a legacy that would continue far beyond Assad's rule. Because real change, it isn't measured by momentary validation. It's measured by lasting impact. Reclaim. Your power enough is enough. This is your revolution. A declaration that you are done living by other people's terms. You silence the critics not by shouting louder, but by transforming in ways they never saw coming. You didn't fight their battles. You walked away from them. You didn't waste energy on revenge. You invested it in your own growth. You chose mastery over mediocrity, peace over pettiness, purpose over approval. And that is what makes your story powerful. Not just that you triumphed, but how you did it. You redefined failure. You embraced radical accountability. You built a life that spoke louder than any insult ever could. And through it all, you learned the ultimate truth. Power isn't given, it's reclaimed. It's in the choices you make every single day. To rise above, to build without apology, to thrive without needing validation from those who doubted you. Now, your life is no longer a response to anyone. It is an anthem of self-respect, resilience, and authenticity. The critics. Their voices have faded into whispers. They no longer matter. They never did. Because the only voice that ever truly mattered was yours. And today, it speaks louder than ever. If this message resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss content designed to elevate your journey. Like this video. It's a simple way to show support and let us know this message hit home. And most importantly, share it with your family and friends, because you never know who needs that extra push to reclaim their power and silence their critics. Together, let's build a community that thrives, grows, and wins unapologetically. See you in the next one. God bless you.